Thank you very much, Tali, for these insightful remarks. And I'd like to open the debate, so we'll be happy to have your thoughts about Morris, about even Elon and Danny's presentation before. Yeah, this is Professor Matthew Silver.
Because you opened in Iraq and Syria, it raised questions in my mind. However you want to define populism and the breakup of the corporate state, how it would work across borders. Because traditions of local power and state power are so different. I spent a year last year in Oxford on sabbatical following how MPs have surgeries in local communities compared to Israel, where we don't elect anybody on a regional basis. And I just wanted to share one anecdote that's very recent to me in one way. A tree fell down in a neighborhood in Oxford in summertime where I was living. And they had signs up that it would be removed in 3 days and possible consultation with who was going to remove it, or any slamazel could have just moved it across the street. Whereas where I live in Carmiel, in a development town in a Russian-speaking neighborhood, there's a promenade on the edge of the town, which is very, very nice, through government money and foreign philanthropy, the Jewish federations, in 2 towns whose names are misspelled on the signs in true Israeli tradition. The water company decided last week to rip the whole thing up, to put a new pipe in. No sign posting. It raises clear and present physical danger to any child or old person who would work there. My question then becomes the traditions of where localism is, where power is, who's embedded, who's embodied, are so different across cultures. That is there any hope of a kind of global populist movement, apart from a scenario where there's a kind of global apocalypse like the 1930s or something?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that very interesting talk, but it's very easy to portray liberals as elitist and as supporting a neoliberal globalized economy. One thing which I thought was missing in this discussion is the issue of minorities and of race, which at least in the American discussion of populism, and possibly also in the Israeli discussion of populism, is very prominent. And you know, it's either there explicitly, or it's there as an undertone, or it's there as so. In other words, that the contemporary liberal coalition, yes, are Starbucks, and you know, liberalism as a lifestyle, and together with minority support, and you can't just ignore that minority support. And the bad feeling about populism, let's say among liberals in the United States, is that it seems to be racist. And the really bad feeling is and the nostalgic feeling is what has happened to the New Deal coalition, where we had white industrial workers, et cetera, forming coalitions with blacks, with minorities, you know, and you know, you need not remind people of the UAW and its work in civil rights. And it's just, you know, the whole civil rights movement's inconceivable without the unions, and that seems to have gone. And you really didn't address that. So I think that's a piece that's missing.
Anytime, First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk and very interesting comments. I think it was very enlightening. What for me is missing in this discussion is the change in the economy of what is scarce and what is and what we are affluent at. And I think the whole analysis is still in the economics of scarcity. And I think the economics nowadays, what is scarce is the environment, and what is scarce is sacred things in the and scarce and many other things that belong to the family and the community. And what we have much too much of is material goods, etc., with all the price that they have on society. And if we are not thinking of the completely different kind of distribution that concern this, and all these new platforms of knowledge where they exploit the work of so many people in the hands of very few companies that become much more dangerous than the most authoritarian countries. Things are changing very, very fast in these things, and I think it's very difficult for us to catch up with all the changes that are happening so quickly. And I think the ideas of the commons and how you manage the commons and commoning are the basic answers of the institution that we should form that are different, and I would be very happy if you will comment on that.
Okay. I'll begin a conversational response, and first of all, just to say, Tali, yeah, sorry. So I've got a tendency to mumble and a tendency to slouch, and my mother isn't alive, so there's no one to correct it. So whenever I used to give a talk, she used to say to me one thing: couldn't understand anything you said. So there we go. Bringing back great memories. So first of all, I just want to say really thank you to Tully, really very much, and I just ask you to take it on trust that your concerns are my concerns completely. So let's just begin at the fundamental philosophical and theoretical level. The problem lies in how do you conceptualize a system of the redistribution of material and democratic power without adopting a unmediated collectivist concept of redistribution and essentially a Rousseauian concept of citizenship, with everything that we've learned over the last 150 years about the way that concentrates power. So what I'm just going to begin with a few formulations of how I deal with it. So the first is to say about, so there are systems, and there are systems of knowledge, and there are systems of the ethical application of that knowledge through human organizations that we sometimes call professions. That's one of the things, that there's an internal aspect to the good. So the good is not exclusively an external set of relationships. There is complexity and internal forms. That's very important in terms of conceptualizing virtue rather than vice. So that's where the internal forms of the labour movement come in, because in the burial society, this is the work I do, so in those burial societies and in the building societies, and then in the development of the institutions of the labour movement, which were also, I think, true here, reciprocity was the dominant form, and that was based on equality. So reciprocity is a form of active equality over time where there's give and take. So you contribute and you get out. So what's key is the class analysis in this. So in England in 1832, that it's absolutely specific. Doctors, lawyers and accountants became professionals and they could go to Oxford. But plumbers, carpenters and technicians, they had to be deregulated and they became there were no forms of that. So the obvious question is the answer to abolish professions, or is the answer to actually elevate vocation and the whole concept of vocation? It's a very, very big aspect of the work. So what I'm trying to deal with is how to generate an active equality. There's got to be a role for the state in redistribution. That's absolutely clear. As which I don't go into here, the superiority of the price system in terms of signals as to what people want in a complex economy. So my troubles were increased by the fact that the socialists lost the economic calculation debate in Vienna. There was a big debate in Vienna in the 30s about a planned economy versus a decentralized, and von Mises and Hayek, I think, won that debate. In other words, there's a discovery process in prices as to what people want that can't be done by computer programming and general state planning. So I'm just raising those issues. So it's clear that there's a role for markets and a role for states. What I've been trying to draw attention to is the decimating effect. So what you have is the professionals are now institutionalized in the state. So then the question becomes, so what do you want to do? Do you want to build and elevate the status of work? So the work we've been doing in England at the moment, one of the big issues is that the care of old people, social care it's called, a very ambiguous way, has essentially been deregulated. It's very low paid, and because people are very busy and they don't like doing it, essentially the contracting out the care of our parents and grandparents is a matter of enormous national trauma, because they go into institutions and get looked after by people who are on very low pay, often don't speak English. So what we're doing is, for example, is trying to set up guilds of social carers and to elevate their status. We're also looking at things like closing half the universities and establishing vocational colleges of status. In other words, it goes back to what I was mentioning in the paper, the transferable skills, that's a pathology of liberal globalisation, but to reduce the professions to vocations would be good, and to elevate manual labour to a vocation would be good. So, in other words, the professional vocational distinction does a lot of work, but that doesn't alter that if you have that status, you're in a better position than if you don't have that status. And so it's about a decentralisation and pluralisation of the status rather than the abolition of status. And that goes back to the role of tradition in these things. So it's extremely, and as you mentioned, I used to go on a huge amount about the family, just so you are aware, and obviously that got me into more trouble than you can imagine with the left, who don't like it. They just don't like it. Don't like love, don't like faithfulness. So that's the thing with economic and political, is that, so this goes back to liberalism, and in a way goes to your point, if I may bring this in now to the general conversation. The first thing about liberalism is the methodological assumption that fundamentally freedom is the emancipation from constraining relationships. And so the methodological starting point is that you begin outside relationships as a chooser, and then the ultimate progressive goal is to transcend all forms of patriarchal, oppressive and constraining relationships, and basically to commit suicide on your own on the internet. You know, that's the goal. That's the telos and the good. And that's the problem. The problem is then liberals try to say that liberty and cross-class and cross-cultural politics is theirs. But it's not. And that's the point in a way my response to you is enthusiastic, but obviously the politics has got to be the reconciliation of estranged interests in relations of reciprocal equality. That's the thing, and not dominance. So what you saw with the New Deal was the ultimate dominance of a professionalised form of corporate capitalism that was laying down the law. And that's got to be resisted. So here's the interesting thing. In the work I do in England is that it's overwhelmingly minorities are quite recent immigrant communities. And they combine this social conservatism and economic radicalism. That's why they get every day of their lives that they're being humiliated in a contractual wage economy. But they have these commitments to family and a commitment to tradition that finds no expression inside that, what you might call the covenantal rather than the contractual as a frame. So Shlomo, the thing is you begin with facts of pluralism and the engagement with a common good, but that's got to be actively negotiated between the interests. It's not. That's another problem with liberalism, is it doesn't like politics. So it likes to begin with its conclusions and gets everybody to agree, rather than engage. That's what I found interesting in Baghdad, is that they were kind of curiously open to how this thing was going to go. So a third, things that I didn't know. So a third of the seats in that coalition were guaranteed for women. They had to have a third seats in the leadership position. And when I talked to Muqtada al-Sadr, that was completely accepted. And that you, headscarf, no headscarf, jeans, leather jacket, that was the language. They're not, but they want to have the conversation about the honouring of the sacred. And what's the sacred in this case? Seemed to be water, was a really important part. And then there seemed to be a real objection, Tally, to the inequality that was, it was like, how comes you've got all, what do you do for this? So what we're tying in is that the fundamental philosophical assumptions of social beingness is a challenge to the fundamental assumption of liberal choosing individualism. And then how do you constrain in a democratic society the domination of the rich and the educated? And what I'm suggesting, Tally, is that without some institutional belonging and power, what you will always get is the domination of state and market. So the nature of those intermediate institutions, their democratization and the participation in them is the force of equality, but there is absolutely a recognition that these are distinct embodiments of the good. So it's not an egalitarian plateau, to use Dworkin's phrase. It's a contested public space of democratic negotiation, and everything hangs on whether people actually participate in them. Just another point, Tally, again, is just how I'm trying to work through all this. It's a resistance to the infinite fungibility of the human form and knowledge that this can just be transferred, is about how to conceptualize the internet and new technology. So I'm working on the assumption that politics and democracy goes on in places and on dry land, and that from Athens, certainly before Athens, if you look at this particular region and the Phoenicians, there's two forms of economy. There's the maritime economy and the landed economy. And in the maritime economy, roughly speaking, has been for 3,000 to 4,000 years discrete. It moves stuff through the water. Enormous wealth was generated through that movement and through the development of insurance, and there was no accountability on that. But then when it hit the shore, when it hit land, there was all manner of political forms of regulation of what happened. Essentially, my analysis of globalization is a bit like my analysis of the ecology. The sea levels are rising and threatening to flood democracy, and what you see on the internet is all the pathologies of the maritime economy: piracy, massive storms, shipwrecks, and we will move to advance. But what it isn't, just because people click on a thing to say that they want something, an internet petition, that's not a form of politics. Politics, I'm saying, is something that involves the development of relationships, a civic culture of disagreement, which is the thing that we're lacking. I got a brilliant invitation from a German organisation to give a talk about Brexit. And they said to me, but you must make sure that it's a left-wing Brexit because we don't associate with right-leaning people. I said, well, that's a good start for a conversation where the AFD is getting 10% ahead of the SPD. I'm glad you don't associate with them. You're doing very well. So Tully, one of the paradoxes is the old is the new, is that human societies find ways of constraining these developments, but I would say that ultimately we haven't found any alternative to the concept of place as the condition of, and that's where it gets to sovereignty. The whole issue in the Brexit debate was, does voting make any difference whatsoever? And it only does if it has power. It only does if you break the European Union forms of procedural legal order. And that's the nature of this democratic debate, is about power and sovereignty. And then, how do we think, Tully, of what you were talking about, the cultural schemas? How do we conceptualize those in ways where the tendency is towards equality and participation and reciprocity? That's what's at stake, is the statecraft aspect. So it can't be just about a clientelistic relationship where we, the state, do this for you. There has to be an element of the democratic, and that will naturally lead to unequal outcomes. But is that bad if the incentive is then put on the participation within the civic institutions and the organisations? That is the sort of thing that should be rewarded in terms of the virtue ethics and the system. And then just very briefly with Matthew, I used to be much more sceptical, just to say, that trip to Baghdad and then the trip to the Kurdish area in Syria made me think that perhaps these are more generalisable than I thought. In terms of capitalism is working as a global system that is dispossessing people, moving them and turning them into contractual wage beings. It's also the massive issue related to the sacred of land, of the dispossession of land and the development of land. England is the first country that really experienced this, really got into the parish democracy and that's where, so the tree is like this sacred thing in England. You can't touch a tree. That's what everybody knows. You can't, nobody's allowed to cut a tree down in there.
Remember Wicks and Hunters by E.B. Thompson?
Yeah, that's the moral economy. That's completely straight out of that. So that's, if you like, an English form of the sacred. So that tree lying there, dead on the ground, is to be mourned. There's a shiver period, that has to be gone through, and then there's issues of how that's going to be treated. But that's not the central issue. Is what I found is a sacred relationship with nature is in fact more widespread than I expected at the beginning of this. I thought this was very heavily culturally particular, but in fact the resonances are more widespread. But the issue is precisely that in a democracy there's going to be a very specific inheritance of cultural forms, and this goes to the final point, sorry Tally, which is I'm trying to find an alternative to concepts of natural capital and human capital, because once you've got capital then it is to be allocated and maximised. And that's a problematic way of thinking about human beings and nature. So the concept that I'm suggesting in its place is the concept of inheritance. We have a natural inheritance, we have a civic inheritance, there is an intellectual inheritance, and that's commonly passed on. So I don't know what the score is, but in England in 19th century novels there was two things you could do with an inheritance. You could nurture it, or you could squander it. And squandering your inheritance was selfish, self-regarding, immediate gratification of needs, wrong. So what we need is, how do we conceptualise all of this? Not in terms of capital, but in terms of inheritance. I'm completely open to that conversation. I can't tell you how much. And I just want to share that is where the debate is at the moment. How do we move beyond the categories of capital to develop a notion of a shared inheritance, so individual, so monetary, civic, political inheritance, and that in a way what was going on with Brexit was that people thought that they were having their inheritance, their democratic inheritance, taken away. I didn't like it. So it's political work to be done with that, and then Leer, it's very. I'm completely with you. In a way, I've tried to answer your thing throughout this answer. There's got to be institutions. There's got to be a mutual. So if only you hold something to be sacred, you're mad, But if you share, so for example, Tully mentioned it. Really successful campaign that we did was over football clubs. So the representation of supporters football clubs, and what we argued for was that half the representative of the board should be directly elected by the fans. And it turned out that they didn't view their clubs as a commodity. That was how the clubs functioned, but their meaning was not exhausted by that. And there was something sacred, and it was very peculiar. A lot of people who'd moved away from the places where their clubs were, the club meant more to the exiles. I think we can understand this as Jews. It meant more to the exiles than it did to the locals who, on the whole, supported Manchester United or Arsenal, as global capitalism would dictate, rather than the forces of democratic liberation identified by Tottenham. But what was interesting was that they were really prepared to engage. But this was a kind of sacred, it was a trust, a covenant. River Plate and Boca, these are forms of belonging. So earning and belonging, Tully, is how we're trying to conceptualise. People have a tendency, a wish to earn, to contribute, and to belong, to be part of something that is missed in the mainstream methodology.
Thank you. Ro'i Maor. I work for an Israeli non-profit NGO working on social and economic policy in Israel. Thank you, Baron Glassman and Tali, for your...
Okay, Lord is fine.
Lord Glassman, okay.
That's an interesting thing in Iraq. That was what really baffled me. They still have got a word. Lord do. They're so used to English lords coming over and ruling that there was a word in the language, Lord do. So everywhere they went, oh, Lord do, Lord do.
So thank you for the very thought-provoking remarks. I admit that I have trouble with the concept of conservatism. Not in the sense that you mentioned of looking at it as something that's backward-looking or closed or uneducated, but rather in the feeling that I have that when I actually interact, whether directly or indirectly, with opinions of people who would consider themselves conservatives or who would be defined by others as conservatives, they don't really reflect this respect for tradition and home and place and affection that you attribute to that viewpoint. Rather, it seems that they are very strongly attached to certain types of homes and places and certain types of affection, and more than progressive, I would say that they seem to favor radical change and displacement in many senses. So in one of the results of capitalism in our society is that things are constantly changing, whether it's bad or good. That's the actual reality that we live in. So when you say that you're in favor of going backwards to something or preserving something, there's a huge amount of selectivity going here. Usually that means that you're in favor of changing and sometimes creating completely new and highly disruptive things in order to preserve something that that you believe in. So that's what troubles me about this perspective, whether it has any kind of coherence in actually existing people, or whether it's just a sort of framework that we use which doesn't really correlate with anything that exists.
You talked about populism, and in many ways you talked about populism as liberals see populism. But I would try to think about populism from within, not from the outside. And the point with populism is that the idea of the people sometimes is the people as the plebs, and sometimes is the people as an ethno-national or an ethno-cultural closed community. Usually populists play with both, but there are populist movements which mainly emphasize the idea of the people as the plebs, and there are populist movements which emphasize mainly the idea of the people as an ethno-cultural closed community. And that could be the difference, for example, between Peronism and Le Pen's Front National. And in that sense, I think that we must be more aware, and once again, as somebody who I consider myself very sympathetic with populism, but still there is a kind of inclusive populism, and there is exclusionary populism, and we should be aware of the differences. And my second point, you give us one of the examples, the German model of, but there is another model which was very short-timed, which was the Maynard Law in Sweden. Yeah. Rudolf Maynard, he was an economist for the trade unions, and he proposed a system by which trade unions could use the part of the profits of very successful businesses to collectively buy part of the enterprise, in order for the workers not to be only part of the board, but really own the firm. And this is different because ownership is still an important part of really participative ways of democracy.
Okay, so let's begin there. So I obviously never thought of myself as conservative until I really started talking to left progressives and their conception of anthropology, which was absolutely plastic. So we've got this thing at the moment, you know, that you self-define as what you are. So I often introduce myself at Labour Party meetings as a Pakistani woman. And people don't even laugh. You know, that's taken so seriously that you can self-define that if you say you're a Pakistani woman, and I say, but I'm obviously not Pakistani and I'm obviously not a woman. And it takes a long time for people to even smile. So what I'm sharing with you is a level of anthropology which has no sense of tradition, body, sociability, culture. But all these things are up for grabs, and in a way, Shlomo, relates to the answer I was trying to give you about the problem with liberalism as a methodology, as a way of approaching things, and this links very much with Danny. I just want to get there. So, it's that when you're dealing with politics, you're not dealing with data and rational material. There's a whole load of, so coming on the plane to Israel, what am I feeling? I'm feeling a lot of inchoate things. Am I going home, or am I going back, or what is this place, and what is the nature of Jews to this land, and what's the role of covenant in that, and what's the notion of historical priority in terms of the assertion of the state? What I'm saying is I'm very, very alert to a load of political stuff going on that's not reducible. And politics is always like that. There's always loads of mayhem flying around. It's just how self-understanding we are of that. I'll return to you. I just wanted to make that point to Roy. Is that then that led me to think, in terms of engaging with people and engaging with some possibility of a genuinely successful politics built around reciprocity, equality and resistance to capitalism, is that there's loads of things that, so this very strong, which I've mentioned, notion that people have that they belong to something. And immediately on the left you get, no, I think we've got to take a critical perspective on that, which essentially reduces any sense of belonging to a form of false consciousness. But obviously, if you look at the history of British politics, this sense that people had that they were dispossessed of their land was as, it goes back to this thing, Tony, the notion that the historical memory of dispossession is as strong, if not stronger, than the argument for equality. That those two things, it wasn't just an argument for equality that led to the creation of the National Health Service and the building of houses. It was the idea that we won the war and that we should do this, that this was a restoration of a wrong. So viewing people as social, relational, with a tendency to pursue meaning turned out to be a very rich area. As I say, I've outlined it as moving from, it's the old opposition between Aristotle and Plato. Plato had an extremely rationalistic conception of the forms and justice, and Aristotle said maybe it's a bit better to start where people are and move from there. And the whole point of democratic conversation as a way of sort of filtering out ideas as they go forward. There are certain things that people are I found very reluctant to say to other people, and that's the beauty of politics. So I find people who will hold quite strongly racist views privately are very reluctant to articulate them to the face of someone of a different race. Things move along in that regard. And I was also, as I say, I'm still working through it, but was very interested in the sheer reluctance to dominate. They didn't want, they kept on saying, but we know what it means to be dominated. But they've got a very strong, I would say, conception of family, but how to link that up with a plural society and democracy is an alive conversation, but it's not dealt with by eliminating social inheritance, language, belonging, place, relationships from an understanding of what gives meaning to life. And that's ultimately the problem, to go back to something with liberalism, is it's got no account of meaning. It's just got account of procedure. So it's very good on procedural justice, very bad on what you do with it, roughly speaking.
Kant would probably disagree.
You can't.
Kant would probably disagree with you.
Do you?
Kant.
No, Kant, well, that's the whole issue with Kant. It was ultimately a generalizable theory, so it wasn't about meaning. He did say that ultimately the keeping of promises, so there was a virtue theory knocking about, but it didn't derive from the theory. It derived from the stuff that was knocking about, like a lot in politics. But I've got a lot of love for Kant, but ultimately I would put him in the Platonic procedural bracket in the end. So Roy, I'm just saying that the anthropology of the person really matters, and it's not that I take a conservative view of the anthropology of the person. It's just what I see is that the progressive left has vacated anthropology and put in its place a hyper-liberal materialism and plasticity that violates people's sense of what is true, what is right, and what is good. And if you begin the conversation by telling everybody that they're wrong, we know what happened to the Litvuks. That's what they're like. So, and then to Danny's, I completely agree with you about there's loads of ways of thinking about ownership and mutual ownership. Goes back to that involves really developing the institutional forms so that those institutions can have power. That wasn't a state project, that was union. An incredible thing in Denmark is that they just put, it was the equivalent of, I don't know, it was like 1% of the union dues were put aside into a fund. And now they've got the biggest investment fund in all of Denmark. The unions don't know what to do with their money. The only problem is people aren't joining the union. They've got, it's a bit like what you said about Labour and the banks. They've got money and no people. That's that I agree is completely right. Now, and that brings to your thing about, so ultimately we're going to have to say that there's good populism and bad populism. That's one of the things that I would certainly argue. But it's always important to begin that every polity is two-faced. I think we've got to understand the two-facedness. America's two-faced, Britain's two-faced, France, they've got so many faces. But certainly, so on the one hand, Israel is a Jewish state, and on the other hand, it's a liberal constitutional order. In America, it's cosmic. On the one hand, it's an ethno-communitarian, white, Anglo project of colonial rule. And on the other hand, it's the free republic and the democratic self-government of the Constitution. Those things are always in play in any polity. But if you completely remove the cultural forms from the state, it loses any ability to function as a democracy. But if you exclusively put the emphasis on a single ethno community, you're going to have it's ugly and terrible. So what you've got to look for is the resources. It is not third-party mediation. Is the resources within each tradition for living with others and reconciling with other people, which I found do exist, but it takes quite a lot of engagement and work. So if you accept the anthropological assumptions I'm giving you, which is that pluralism is a fact, and people hold different historic memories, there's always going to be an argument about what it means to belong. Goes back to your thing. The issue is not belonging. I take that as a given. The issue is, how do you facilitate the argument about what it means to belong? And that's the very substance of the democratic conversation. So what you get in bad authoritarian populism is the denial of the argument and the polarization around that. What I'm raising with you is that such was the nature of the progressive position in America at the last election, that you can understand completely, reasonably, why people voted for Trump. It was just a humiliation, an endless humiliation of the sacred, of values, of place, in favour of this liberal teleology of globalisation. So what's essential is I guess what's essential is to have the trust in the people that you're living around, to live with the tension and the mess of real political conversation, and see if the alliances can be brokered on the basis of the protecting of the human person from domination by capitalism and also by state procedure in the name of a decentralised democracy. That's the key overall.
I've got 2 questions, but other questions out there? Okay, Ofer and I are kind of going to jump in, but go ahead. Going in? No, settle.
Thanks a lot. I think this is like really, for me, a very, very interesting discussion.
What's your name?
Ronen. Yeah. So I have one more like a comment and the other which not too ordered, so I hope it would be clear. And it goes back to kind of the dialogue between you and Tali, right? What Tali like the criticism she suggested, and I think for this discussion, it's interesting and it's important, because normally we think about neoliberalism or economic liberalization as a process which brings in inequality or enhances inequality. But what Tali suggested was that actually, especially if you think about the context that preceded economic liberalization. It might be that actually economic liberalization can enhance, especially for certain groups, certain people, equality. And if I understand correctly, your answer to her was, well, it's really about the political and socio-political institutions, the intermediate institutions, and which can bring us a more stable, a more robust, a more sustainable forms of equality. I would suggest than the ones that economic liberalization or let's say neoliberals think about or wish for.
Yeah. So the way I put it is that the equality requires a civil ecology.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to just saying that.
So my question here is. What happens if we cannot guarantee this kind of social and political institutions? The one you... And if this is the case, maybe some people would prefer the economic liberalization option, the neoliberal option. And the other question was, you mentioned in your last reaction that liberalism eventually offers mainly a procedure. And I was wondering whether what you suggest is more than a procedure, because what is the substantive context, for example, the religious context of the Shia in Iraq or Shas here, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so
let's finish the questions, I think, because I'm looking at the time, and then you'll just take them to the answer. I have two quick questions. One a comment and one a question. A comment, a quick story. I wrote an article recently that I sent to Shlomo, and in a very kind and gentle way, Shlomo explained to me that I was completely wrong in what I wrote. And what I was writing was that, taking what you're talking about and talking about the devastation of the, periphery of the, where the popular uprising comes from, etc. And I'm bastardizing, I'm sure, Shlomo's point, but Shlomo basically said Israel's situation, I don't know if it's exceptionalist, but the situation of those that are left out is very different than those that were left out in other places, and therefore we get other forms of it. You're not going to be able to answer that question, but I think the question of what that dynamic is of, populism in Israel and how it plays itself out in terms of economic issues and the periphery and the center, I think is important to see in what ways this actually does map on and which ways it doesn't map on to the Israeli situation, one. And two, and this is going back to, what will forever be known in the discussion as the Talley-Morris discussion. So equality is a very liberal leftist value. Right, in the classic sense is whether what, and also socialist. I'm sorry, leftist value that's around it for sure. And I think there's two questions. What do we mean by equality? For example, I think the Wall Street, right? I don't think that kind of that rebellion against the 1 in or the 99% resonated with a lot of populism, and I think that their sense of what equality is there. I mean, that's a wide generalization, but the assumption that equality in that sense resonates with large proportions, I have questions of whether that's true. And I think that the question of what do we mean by equality and what different moral economies mean by equality, I think is a central kind of question to understanding how we approach the equality issue to begin with. Like the term itself, I think, is contested in different moral economies. So that was my second point.
Okay.
And I use my privilege.
Abuse.
So I have also one short comment and one small big question. The comment is about the discussion here about conservatism, which I would like to reinforce your position by saying that the progressive view sees what Jean-Claude Michéa, the French philosopher, sees it as the complex of Orpheus, the way that you cannot look back, and the only way there is always the future is before us, and the future will always be better. I mean, these are.
Oh yeah.
And now we live in a period or an era where the future might not be better. I mean, we have ecological crisis which is underway, and we have also a technological revolution which which has the potential to destruct the human race. I mean, artificial intelligence and in this, if this is the situation, then maybe be conservative might be the progressive solution. So this is the comment. The second small and big question is about feminism, which I think is all over a word which is above us, and I think that this is also from discussing with friends from less liberal communities. Liberalism is a sort of protection and a sort of empowering and a sort of a strong defense against non-liberal practices and patriarchal, and in this way, this is something very, very valuable.
Okay, got it. So first, that's clearly true, and all I've been trying to do is say that that's part of a wider inheritance that not. Oh, sorry. There's that thing again, slouching and mumbling. That's not exclusively held by liberalism, and also it is. I mentioned it. It's kind of in passing earlier. Is that poor women and the support of poor women is absolutely vital, and I didn't realise how intensely that inheritance was treasured. I mentioned the Kurds in Syria. Every local commune. So as I said, just think back. Democratic Confederalism, where they're at, is sort of Israel around about the Yishuv around about 1905, around there, where there was a real thoughts about democratic confederal of living with the Palestinians in reciprocal community. There's a whole load of stuff about that. Some of the streets around here are named after the thinkers who used to talk about that. We really talk about it, but what was incredible about it, which also, if you look back to that early kibbutz writing, was the emancipation of women. That this was an extremely... So every local, what they call commune, I would call it, it's even smaller than that. So every 12 streets, so they elect a woman and a man as co-chairs. So it's a structural thing. And no meeting is quora unless there's 40% women attending. I think these are extremely... But what was very interesting about attending the communes was that there were women there completely in the full body armour, whatever that is. I always get niqab. And there was lots of headscarves, virtually majority headscarves. And this was all being negotiated as a space of mutual... In other words, the people came in as who they were and represented who they represented and looked like the people that they represented, but they did all comprehend that this was a mutual space, a public space. So it's just to bring I completely with that, and that's got to play an absolutely essential role. And to express that in terms of culture and class, it goes right back, Tali, not the rejection of culture, but the engagement with it and the building of reciprocal forms. So this is just the tragedy of it all, and where and it goes back to offer what you were saying. So what we know in our collective history as Jewish people is that there are no guarantees. This is what we're always looking for, but I want a guarantee. In fact, I would describe the culture that I grew up in North London as the culture of the guarantee. We want to know, are we safe? We want to know, are we going to get value for money? We want a guarantee. And my mother's life was spent in constant dispute with various shops and public institutions that didn't do what they said they were going to do. So I just want to give the psychological dimension, and obviously politics, there are no guarantees. And we tend to think that you have a written constitution and you have all these forms of rights, it's going to be a guarantee. You have a state of Israel and the Jewish people are going to be safe. It's a guarantee, but it's not a guarantee. Because you've got to live a common life with people who are different in tension. And that's the guarantee. But if you withdraw from that life, you're in trouble. That's essentially, we're all in trouble. If we withdraw from a reciprocal, equal relationship with poor people and try to rule them, we're in trouble. And that's what this populism is about. So the paradox is, the greatest guarantee is tension and dispute. That's got to. There's no opting out of that. I think so. That's the democratic polis, but then that's a reciprocal commitment. And it just to bring you the news is that once you get into that space, it's a good space. It works. It works well. It's when you withdraw. I mean, you talk about the specificity of Israel. I don't understand it. Any economy like this in any other place would have mass immigration to do the childcare, to do the cleaning, to do, this would be a feature of the economy, but I don't know if it is. I just don't, I don't know. Well, if that's happening, then you've got it. Then that.
Elder Square.
Yeah, so the ethnic global division of labour. So roughly speaking, what you should be having is Filipinos in to do the childcare. What you roughly should be having some Africans in to do some security work for the late night supermarkets, and then there's a whole variety of people brought in, to fulfil basic prostitution functions for the liberals. I just see that everywhere I go. There's importing of labour to do the work that other people don't want to do. But I didn't know if it was happening here. If it is happening here, then everything will proceed in the correct way. Then you'll have to build a relationship with the people who are coming to do that work. And over time, you will have to recognise them as social beings that aren't just here to fulfil an economic function.
Write down the policy of the government to kick them out every 5 years.
Okay, well then that's going to be I would imagine the capitalists will have something to say about that kind of turnover, because they want to have some more secure. I'm just saying, I'm very interested there. I was just looking around and I saw hints of it, but not anywhere near. So for example, if you go to Doha, there's a complete ethnic division of capitalist labour. The Indians in the airport, the Malaysians walking the kids. I'd like to know what they're actually doing for a living in Doha. But once that happens, the government can do what it will. There will be a negotiation of what is what the space is, and that's going to be far more complicated than simply an Israeli-Palestinian one. It's going to, what's the nature of that in a society? Anyway, so basically, just to summarise, is that there are no guarantees. I think that's the best I can do of sharing what I know. So thank you.